Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia online. I'm Laura Kovacs, and I'm honored to be here. Nadia Owusu won a 2019 Whiting Award for her debut memoir, Aftershocks. The book tells the story of the nomadic childhood she spent following her father, a United Nations official across Africa and Europe, and her arrival in New York in the wake of his passing. An NPR review calls the book a powerful memoir of a life upended, then pieced back together, well wrought and powerful. This evening, she'll be joined in conversation with writer and librarian Maisy Card, author of These Ghosts Are Family. And now the screen is all yours.
I'm going to read a very short excerpt. It's from a chapter called Failures of Language. I do not have my great-grandfather's worn but carefully pressed cotton handkerchief. My father's family aren't much for holding on to material things. I do not have my maternal great-grandmother's red hair or my paternal grandfather's coffee bean skin. What an unusual combination, people often say when I describe my parentage, Ghanaian, Armenian, and more than once, how did that even happen? I speak 3.5 languages that do not belong to me, that do not run through my veins. English, Italian, and French, decent Swahili. When my relatives and country people maneuver between English and their home languages, Twi, Armenian, and Turkish, I grip the ropes of the English words as firmly as my jittery hands will allow and loop them into knots. I watch for cocked eyebrows and pursed lips to translate the rest. The warm, round percussion of Twi and the orderly harmony of Turkish, which spoken by my family is diluted with a splash of archaic Armenian and a heavy pour of Boston accent, are familiar but impenetrable. I can spot members of my two disparate tribes in a crowd, but I cannot address them except in basic greeting and pleasantry. Good morning. How are you? Welcome. In Tree, I can also say even the elephant can swat flies with its short tail, and any river loses its identity when entering the sea. My father, when his intention was to remind or chastise, was fond of proverbs and folk tales. The heroes of those tales were animals of the forests, spirits, and gods. I know them by name. My Ghanaian relatives are at times tickled by my inability to speak Tree. At other times, they are affronted. How can you not speak your own language, they ask, not acknowledging that my learning it would have required them to teach me. Once, when I was in the market with an auntie, I cannot remember which one, a woman asked why no one had taught me to speak my father tongue. Nobody wants to hear her speaking Tree in an American accent, the auntie replied. Since she replied in English, I can only assume she meant for me to understand. In Tree, I cannot say, love me, accept me. At 13, I couldn't ask my father not to die. In Turkish, I know the words for eggplant, yogurt, and savory pastries. The stories of my mother's family are very much concerned with food, what was served, whose dish was tastiest, and delicious gossip, who messed up the baklava. As a child, when I visited them in Massachusetts, we talked about eggplant, losh kebab, and pilaf with little chopped up noodles in it. We planned for dinner as we washed lunch dishes. We ate to remember those who escaped genocide and nearly starved in the desert, to honor what they made possible for us. My grandmother taught me to roll rice and lamb into grape leaves. My mother read to me from 1001 Nights. Ali Baba said, "Open sesame," and discovered a stolen treasure. A genie emerged from a lamp to do Aladdin's bidding. Scheherazade told tales to a king to delay her own execution. Another one, I said to my mother after each story. Tell me another one. I do not know the Turkish word for stay. At 7, I could not say, Mama, come back. In Armenian, the language largely lost to my mother's family generations ago at the hands of the Ottoman Empire, the only word I know is the word for underwear, vardig. This knowledge I cannot explain. When I encounter strangers from my tribes, they are startled by my attempts to communicate. They do not recognize me as one of their own. They laugh, charmed, and perhaps a little disturbed by the discrepancy between appearance and sound. When I explain myself, they think me a curious hybrid. They speak to me always in English. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I guess what I want to talk about first was, you know, one thing that struck me is that even though this book is about being kind of dislocated from home, I was really struck by all the family stories. It just seemed, especially your description of your father's family history, and I wondered, and your mother's stories too, from her side of the family and experiencing the genocide. I wondered kind of if you always knew this history growing up, or if it's some of it was kind of reconstructed while you were writing the book.
Yeah, so I knew some of it growing up, and I had heard stories, bits and pieces of stories and anecdotes. And, I very much knew that my family, for example, had escaped genocide, and that's why I'm American. And some of Ghanaian history and Ashanti history, my father was very intent on teaching my sister and I, particularly because a lot of the schools that we went to, we didn't get very much African history at all. And so, I did grow up with some of those stories and that history. But as I was writing the book, one of the intentions behind it for me was to narrate myself closer to those histories, and in a way find connection, deeper connection to my families through a deeper understanding of the contexts in which they came from and the kind of forces that shaped their lives that, I knew anecdotally, but also wanted to kind of to understand in a more embodied and deeper way.
And you talk about in the book your father writing poetry and the two of you reading together and writing together. So did you always know that you wanted to be a writer, or was your father kind of your influence for this book, or was it something that you thought about later?
Yeah, no, I did. As long as I can remember, I've wanted to be a writer. And I think probably it was influenced by my father. He was always reading, always had books around, and he wrote to process the world himself. He was always scribbling in a notebook, and he did write poetry. And he would encourage me, when I would say I'm bored, I would be complaining, and he would be like, boredom is a disease. And also, here is a pen and paper, write a novel, and then come and show it to me at the end of the day. And so I would sort of lie on my belly in his office, kind of scribbling little novels and illustrating them. And he was my first editor, and he gave me feedback on my work, and then I would go and revise it.
I wondered what your experience was like writing something so personal, especially in regards to your family reading it. I know, my book is not, it's fiction, but I sometimes say it's like kind of inspired by my family. But I just kind of assume that because my family doesn't really, they're not big fiction reader, that they just never will read my book. But I would be very nervous if they actually did. So has your family read this book? Did you kind of prepare them for it before it came out?
Yeah, so I was in conversation with a lot of people in my family about the book for a while, because I also, wanted to ask questions and to see if their memories of some of the moments that I was writing about were the same as mine. And sometimes they were, and sometimes they weren't. And so we would have conversations. And then also, kind of along the way, I started kind of publishing some of the chapters from the book as excerpts, as essays in literary journals and magazines. And I would share them with my family, because it was really important to me to kind of hold this principle that I had for writing about my family, which was that I was writing towards deeper love and connection for them. And so, holding that principle, I hoped that they could see that even if I was writing about challenging things, conflict or difficult things, that was really the force that was kind of driving the book. And um, my mother, who is kind of at the heart of the book, and in some ways, as well as my father, who's no longer with us. But um, my mother and I sort of were starting to have a relationship, to build a relationship. She left when I was 2. And so we were beginning to build a relationship as I was kind of publishing some of these pieces. And it helped us to have more honest conversations with each other. It helped me to understand sort of some of the choices that she made, including around, why she left. And I think that the experience of having those conversations allowed us to see each other as kind of more fully realized human beings, and not just people who show up in each other's lives or play roles in each other's lives. But so yeah, so I have been nervous for some of the pieces, and some people in my family reading certain pieces, but it also just felt like a way to honor them in some ways by kind of connecting to this history, and kind of trying to, through the writing of it, move myself to like even deeper relationship with them.
So that relates a bit to another question I was going to ask. There's a part of the book where you discuss epigenetic inheritance, the idea that like trauma alters our genes, and you discuss how your mother's ancestors lived through the Armenian genocide. So I wondered if that kind of doing that research kind of also led to your kind of reconciliation with your mother, or was it just kind of your experience of coming out of that depression and having those realizations about your father that led to it?
Yeah, I mean, it was both of those things. I actually started writing what eventually became this book. As you're saying, coming out of a period of really deep depression, and actually, like, I was writing pieces of it while I was in this really deep depression, and what some might call, a mental breakdown. Um, and so it really started as a private project, and I was really kind of writing it for myself and doing this research for myself. I just had this awareness that, we carry history in our bodies, and that we are history in many ways, living and breathing. And, I do remember really vividly my father telling me about how the trauma of the Armenian genocide was in my family's DNA. And when I was in this period of depression, I was estranged from my mother, and I had been for over a decade. And I had been sort of not looking directly at these griefs, the griefs of my father's death when I was 13, the grief of my mother leaving, the difficult relationship that I had with my stepmother. And it's sort of, you can try and run away from trauma and grief for only so long, and the body is kind of storing it, and it does catch up with you. And so I had this really clear sense that one of the ways that I was going to find my way out of this was working to better understand my family, and the decisions that they made, and the histories that they carried in their bodies too, that sort of made my life possible. Many of them kind of miraculous histories, walking across the desert and coming to a new country in my mother's family's case. And in fact, my grandparents had, or great grandparents had been separated during the genocide, and sort of found each other in America in a very kind of miraculous way. And so yeah, I did have this awareness that I was intentionally trying to write myself towards understanding. And I don't think that I kind of framed it this way for myself, but I was moving towards reconciliation, and kind of moving myself to a place where I could extend enough understanding and compassion to eventually reconcile with my mother, because the anger that I was carrying was not serving me. And I had kind of longed for her for much of my life. And so that's sort of like how this worked. And the kind of material that the raw material that I kind of created through that process, that really was a private reckoning and process, I set aside for a couple of years, and thought that I would write other things. I went and started to try and write a novel that was sort of tangentially related to some of this material, but fictionalized. And then eventually it just kept speaking to me, and I wondered if I could make art out of some of that research, and some of the kind of writing that I had done. And so that's sort of how the book began.
Yeah, that was actually another part of the book that I really loved, was that it feels like you kind of shift writing styles at different moments. A lot of it is very poetic, but then you have a lot of historical information and historical analysis and kind of cultural and social analysis about all the places that you've lived. And I love how you tie it all together by using earthquakes as a metaphor. And I was wondering where you got that inspiration from.
Yeah. So when I did realize that that I wanted to see if I could turn this kind of raw material into a book, I, started to kind of write some of those histories, and to also write, about my personal experience. And I always knew that I wanted it to be kind of a mixed genre book. I knew that it couldn't be a linear book because that's not how I experienced the world. And I knew because the kind of project, the private project, began as a way to kind of both reckon with my own experience and my own life, the events of my own life, and the histories and the forces that shaped my life. And I wanted that to be kind of the spirit of the book as well. And so the way that I approached it was that I would often start with, a really vivid memory from my life and then expand out to try to understand kind of what was happening around that memory. So a memory of having a conversation with my father about my mother, which was a rare occurrence because he also carried hurt from the end of their relationship too. But so a memory of talking to him about my mother would then expand out into sort of an exploration of the Armenian genocide and the history behind it. A memory of sort of going to see the stool house, which is sort of where the throne of the Ashanti kingdom is housed, kind of turns into an exploration of colonization of Ghana and the history of the Kwame Nkrumah and the independence movement of Ghana. And so I always knew that I wanted to kind of play with moving back and forth between my own life and these bigger histories and cultures. But I also was struggling with structure for the book because once I was not writing it just for myself, the question was like, what are the threads that sort of that readers can hold on to? And it was actually in showing the book to some early readers, people in my life, where they kind of pointed out, you write a lot about earthquakes and they show up, seismic language shows up a lot in your work. And once they told me that, I was able to see that in my own work. And I realized that in many ways I have for a very long time kind of lived inside this earthquake metaphor, which dates back to how the book opens, which is when I was 7 years old. My family was living in Rome, Italy, because of my father's job. And after a very long absence, my mother kind of showed up at our house on the same day that I learned that a catastrophic earthquake had destroyed a city in Armenia. And that was one of the rare occurrences. I heard this on the radio. My father always listened to the BBC World Service. And, I asked my father what aftershocks were. And then I also asked him, if my mother had family in Armenia. And he said, aftershocks are the Earth's delayed reaction to stress. And then also told me that no, my mother no longer had family in Armenia or in Turkey, that they're all in America or in Argentina. And so we had this conversation, and then my mother showed up. And I think, being so young, in my mind, I had already kind of made this connection between this earthquake and the earthquake of my mother showing up and then leaving again on the same day. And because I was only 2 when my mother left, I had never really had to face the rejection. I always felt, a longing for a mother, but I had never experienced sort of watching her walk away that I could remember. And so I think that those seismic events kind of got muddled up inside me and showed up in the book. And so when people pointed out that I was using a lot of seismic language, I was like, oh yes, this earthquake kind of shaped my life and my understanding of the world. And maybe this is a thread that can help tie together the different kind of disparate nonlinear pieces of this book as well.
One of the things I thought about too when you mentioned in the book is kind of dealing with the unknown. So one of the major, I guess, upheavals or earthquakes that you mentioned, of course, is your father passing away, then your stepmother, telling you that he died of HIV and not cancer, or AIDS and not cancer. So I wonder, how writing this kind of helped you process, that kind of realization, or, not knowing the truth about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, my stepmother kind of revealing that information. I was in my 20s and my stepmother came to visit me in New York, and we had this very complicated relationship that on the one hand was a caring, loving relationship. My stepmother, when my father died, when I was 13, and I called my mother and she was still not ready to sort of be my parent. And my stepmother stepped up and said, you know, I will raise you and your sister until you're 18 and leave for college. And, you know, I will always be so grateful to her for that. At the same time, sort of the shape of our relationship had already been set in some ways. And it was set when, you know, she came into our lives when we were young, and my sister and I were very clingy with my father. And so there was, you know, some competition and some tension, and that only kind of became exacerbated after he died, because in some ways we were then battling for his memory, and we wanted to hold on to his memory in different ways. And so it was a, you know, sometimes difficult relationship. And she came to New York, where I was living at the time, and we had a fight over something very petty. And in that fight, she revealed, you know, what is either a secret or a lie. I still don't actually know whether my father had HIV. I do know that he had cancer, but I also know that some cancers occur a lot in people who are HIV positive. But that revelation, because I had sort of made of my father, you know, a hero and a godlike person, or godlike figure in my life, and my grief for my father in some ways was a comforting place that I returned to. And I say that it was comforting in that the other side of grief is love. And so the knowledge of that deep love that I had with my father, who was the great hero of my life when he was alive, was something that I clung to because I had a lot of uncertainty in my life and a lot of loss. And and so that sort of revelation caused me to question my relationship with him, which was one of the things, you know, in my life that was constant and steady. And so that's actually what kind of led to this real reckoning. I was sort of already in a very difficult place in terms of my mental health, but with that revelation, I retreated for a week to a blue rocking chair in my bedroom, which also features a lot in the book. And I felt like I really needed to retreat from my life and to kind of grieve in a way that I'd never allowed myself. And I was very aware that what I needed to do was to imagine and write myself a story that I could live inside of, because the stories that I'd been given about my history, but not just my personal history, you know, going back to what we were talking about before, about African history, about the history of the Armenian genocide, were they weren't inhabitable for me anymore. And so I wanted to sort of more like write myself to closer to a deeper understanding of, you know, how things came to be the way they were in my life, and to narrate myself to a place where I could accept that my father was, you know, a human man, and you know that whatever was revealed, you know, whatever my stepmother said didn't change our relationship, didn't change the love that we had, and in fact that I needed to interrogate some biases within myself that that I recognized the more that I wrote. Like, why was it more acceptable to me for my father to die of cancer than HIV? You know, that was a bias that I recognized in myself that made me deeply uncomfortable, as someone who has always seen myself as really open-minded. And so I had to do some work on myself. You know, it wasn't just sort of being angry at my stepmother, although I certainly did a lot of that, but also kind of pushing myself to be more willing to look at difficult and challenging things, including sort of my own biases and ideas about the way that the world works, and you know, who I am in the world.
One of the aspects of the book that I think you do like an amazing job of articulating too is kind of the legacy of colonialism and white supremacy. It just and I think it's you do a unique job because it's very rare that one person has lived in so many different countries and can compare. But I wrote down one of the quotes you wrote. I was trying to understand the ways in which I had become a different kind of Black than I was when I was in England. I was trying to understand the ways in which I had become a different kind of Black than I was in England, in Italy, in Tanzania, in Ethiopia, in Uganda, in Ghana. In each of those places, being Black meant something different. And I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit. I guess what and also you do that really powerful chapter too, where you talk about police violence, and you do it using this your brother kind of as an example. Yeah, so I just wondered like how your experiences have kind of reflected on this concept of Blackness.
Thanks. Thanks for saying that. Yeah, so it was really important to me to sort of explore, Blackness as an idea, and also Blackness as a home that I have always connected to because, we did move around so much. I lived in a different country every couple of years, and um, and because my father's Ghanaian, my mother is Armenian American. I was born in Tanzania. I grew up sort of straddling a lot of borders. But one thing that my father would always emphasize to me is the solidarity. He had a very Pan-African philosophy and worldview, and so he would always emphasize how important this solidarity across the Black diaspora was, and that gave me something to feel connected to, and to see a lot of pride in, the strength and creativity and solidarity of Black people. And it allowed me to feel, connected to something sort of big and loving, and to see sort of a home in that. And and to define home really expansively, through the Black diaspora. And at the same time, moving around as I did, it also was really clear to me that anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon. And, sometimes people think about it like as only existing in Europe or America, but there are ways that colonization has kind of produced the supremacy of whiteness, even in countries that are Black led, and that there's a lot of work in undoing, white supremacy in ourselves as people and in culture, in our systems and structures. And so I really wanted to take an honest look at that, and to look at my own experience of being a Black person in the different places where I lived. And so, some of the experiences that I write about, for example, is when my family lived in Ethiopia, where it was one of the few places where when I was in Ethiopia, people didn't ask me where I was from as much as they did, when I was in other places, in Europe, for example. People just kind of assumed that I was Ethiopian. And at the same time, a lot of Ethiopians, at least at the time, I'm curious to know if this is still true, but didn't see themselves as Black and did not identify as Black people, which was, when we first arrived there, quite confusing to me. And so in Ethiopia, I was often not considered Black, but my father was considered Black. And so that was just a very interesting and strange experience. And then, in Ghana, where, Ghana was the first African country to gain independence, there's a lot of pride in that. And, the center of the Ghanaian flag is a Black star, symbolizing the Black star will rise, which is, connecting to Pan-Africanism. And yet a lot of people, my aunties and uncles, some of them bleach their skin to be lighter skinned. And, I recalled a moment where I was sort of sitting out in the sun, and an auntie kind of running up to the house, like, "What are you doing? Get back into the house. Like, do you want to be Black like me?" And so sort of exploring that stigma that still exists around Blackness there. And then, in the British context, there's often this, the history that you're taught in school. I went to boarding school in England, is that, oh, well, the UK, or, we rejected slavery long before America, and so racism doesn't exist here the way that it does there. And then meanwhile, I'm looking around, and there's, still a lot of inequality, and a lot of anti-Blackness in the UK as well. And so sort of exploring the anti-Blackness in the UK, and particularly around how it intersects with class, and how class in the UK intersects with voice and the way that you speak. There are posh accents, and then there are accents that are, Cockney leaning, which are, considered lower class, and, who speaks with what accent, and how that is connected to ideas around Blackness as well. And then I moved to the United States. I was born a US citizen because my mother was American. But I didn't grow up among my mother's family, and I didn't live in the US until I was 18, although I visited a few times. So a big part of my coming of age was coming to understand the racial arrangement in America when I moved here for college and my place in that arrangement. And it was really quickly clear to me that race and racism sort of shape so much in American life. You know, the way that all of our systems work, whether that's where people get to live or where people go to school, are shaped by racist thinking. And that even when we got rid of those laws on the books, that thinking has continued to be very central to the American experience and the Black American experience. And I don't think that I fully understood that when I moved here. You know, the story that we were taught in school. I went to international schools, and that's why I sounded American too. So that's also how my experience maybe differed from, you know, some African immigrants who would move here and be seen as African, and my experience moving here and having everyone assume that I was, you know, fully American and that I had grown up here. So I think that sort of also shaped the way that people experienced me and that I experienced America, because there wasn't sort of this, oh, where are you from? You know, but yeah, the story that I understood or that I was taught in the international schools that I went to, that were, a lot of them were sort of taught by American teachers. And we went through the US system, education system, internationally, but it was, you know, there's still racism, but we've made so much progress, and Martin Luther King happened, and you know, there's a little bit of racism, but it's not that bad. And you know, I don't think that I expected that when I arrived here I would just be able to see those disparities and inequities just in walking around. And then also kind of the way that some white people reacted to me was very different, as were their expectations of me. You know, professors acting extravagantly surprised when I did well in class, for example. Or, you know, as you're talking about, when my younger brother moved here, it was even more jarring because he found himself living in New York as a Black man, young Black man, during the height of stop and frisk, and was sort of harassed by the police on several occasions, had, you know, a couple of violent encounters. And the way that the world saw him was so different from the way he understood himself. And, you know, he's much younger than me and primarily grew up in Africa. You know, by the time he was sort of coming of age, my stepmother was no longer living in Europe. And so it was a very jarring experience for him. And then also for me, because I was getting to see the country through his eyes as well.
Yeah, that was one of the moments that yeah, really stuck out to me, because there you talk a lot in the book about privilege, and you know how when you were in Ethiopia or in these other countries, you know, your father worked for the UN, so you had this degree of privilege, and you literally had, you know, guards with guns protecting you from experiencing a lot of the trauma that the, you know, people who were born there were experiencing. But I thought that that was a really moving section where you were worried about your brother and police brutality, because, you know, it's ironic because I feel like a lot of Americans don't think of this as this like terrifying space, but it seemed like a uniquely American kind of I guess moment of terror, or you know, comparative, because you do have that moment where in a, I think when you're in Ethiopia and the house girl's son like runs to your family for protection. But I saw like parallels, you know, in both those moments. I just want to remind everybody watching that I'm going to switch to Q&A in a couple minutes. So if you have any questions, just put it in the chat or the Q&A right now. Another question I had was your influences, like who are some of the writers who influenced you while you were writing this?
Sure. So, I mean, I've always thought of myself as having sort of a council of mothers that I often would turn to, and a lot of them were are Black women writers, who I kind of discovered very fortunately quite young, because my father had a huge collection of books, and so some of them are Audre Lorde, Intozake Shange, Tsitsi Dangaremba, Zora Neale Hurston, Toni Morrison. And so I would always sort of return to them for wisdom, and they sort of helped me to sort of shape an understanding of Black literature and the ways in which Black literature and storytelling, again, across the diaspora, have so many similarities and connections. And I read an essay by Toni Morrison where she was writing about what she thinks are sort of the core tenets of African American literature. And one of them was sort of that she believes that a lot of Black writers sort of write to be heard aloud as well as read on the page. And I connected that to sort of the really ancient storytelling, oral storytelling tradition of the Ashanti tribe, which my father came from, and sort of aimed to sort of pay attention to the rhythm of language. You know, Ashanti people are also known for our drumming. And so I was, you know, sort of making all of these connections between sort of talking drums and the oral storytelling traditions. And then the other idea that was really compelling to me, which was also very alive in your book as well, Maisy, was this idea of sort of the collective voice and community voice, and the way that community voice shows up in Black literature. And so, you know, I was really sort of looking for those kinds of inspirations to sort of guide me in my thinking about what was possible on the page, and how I could be part of this tradition of Black literature and sort of celebrate those traditions.
I'll just ask one more question before we turn to the audience questions. You reminded me of a moment in your book that I really related to also, which was when you were talking about shifting accents, and how you used to speak with a British accent and now you speak with a more American accent, and how a person you dated at the time kind of like felt almost like he didn't trust you because you were able to like switch so easily. But and you quoted the Zadie Smith essay, I think it's called Speaking in Tongues. And I relate to that too, because I spoke with an accent when I was young, and then all of it, I think you mentioned like some people, they start with one and it disappears. And I feel like I was one of those people where it just like disappeared. And it's like I had this moment of shock when I was older, when I realized that it was just gone and I couldn't switch back and forth. Yeah, so I guess I wonder how where you're at now, like, do you feel like you can code switch and you feel comfortable kind of going back and forth in these different spaces? And does your kind of accent change as you move through different places?
Yeah, so I've thought a lot about this, and you know, this accent that I'm speaking in right now is the accent that I use and that I dream in now. And so in some ways, like you, my British accent and the accent that I had before my British accent, which I'm told, although I don't remember, was sort of a Tanzanian accent, like more influenced by my surroundings there. And then I went to British schools, you know, until I was 7 or 8, I forget. But then when I started going to American schools, you know, when you're that young, you sort of pick it up. And I have been told, though, that sometimes I have a wobbly accent, and I place kind of a heavy emphasis on my T's, and people will say sort of, why are you speaking in a British accent, and be sort of suspicious about it.
Sometimes
Yeah.
in high school, a lot of kids would say that to me, like, are you British?
Yeah. Yeah, so that still happens. So in some ways, yeah, I guess I do sort of move back and forth without knowing that I'm doing it. And then at times I'm sort of met with suspicion. But then there is also this way where when I'm among my family, I do think that my accent sometimes will revert back to what it was before. And um, I don't know, like I for a long time, because people would so often be suspicious or be like, why are you faking an accent? That I felt self-conscious about it. But I think in part through writing this book, I've begun to see, I know the ways in which kind of enforced code switching, and by that I mean sort of the ways that Black people, other people of color, when you go into sort of white spaces,
Yeah.
whether that's the education system or the workplace, and you feel like you have to adopt a certain voice, you know, that's a harmful thing. But there are other kinds of code switching that I think are such a celebration of like the multiplicity that we carry in us. And so I'm coming to a place where I'm less self-conscious about my wobbly accent, and sort of seeing it as a way to celebrate my many cultures.
Yeah, that was one of the paragraphs that I really loved about, about code switching being kind of empowering. So let's turn to the Q&A. I'll start from the bottom up. So this is actually, I think it's answered in your book, but I can't remember. So Janet wants to know, how did your parents meet?
Oh, yeah, it is answered in my book. So My father came to the United States to go to college on a scholarship through the Ghanaian government, where they were kind of paying for very promising young people to study in America and the UK. And I think some people went to Germany as well. And so my father went to university in Ohio, and then decided to stay in the States for graduate school, and went to Tufts in Massachusetts. And my mother grew up in Watertown, Massachusetts, which actually has one of the biggest Armenian populations in the world, and second biggest in the country. The first is Glendale, California. And so she had grown up there, and they met through mutual friends.
Joel wants to know where he can get the book, but it's actually, I think the link should be in the chat. The ordering information is in the chat. Another question, how does your master's in urban planning fit into your writing career at all? And does that learning appear in your writing in any form, maybe some type of mapping?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that that my writing informs how I think about my policy and planning work, and vice versa. I mean, I think in my writing, and in this book in particular, I'm very interested in the ways in which, people interact with each other. What makes a community? How does the built environment sort of shape our lives? What does the ways in which people kind of access resources, like what does that mean for how we live in community with each other? And those are the kinds of concerns that I'm working on in my sort of planning and policy work as well, because I work in the social justice space. And so I'm always thinking about, like, how can we make communities more inclusive? How can we ensure that people can have a sense of home and connectedness in the places where they work? How do you foster community? And so I think through my writing, I'm exploring that through imagination, through connecting to my own experience. And then I hope to bring that into the policy and planning work that I do, because I do think that we need much more imagination in our policy and planning work, particularly because so many of our systems and structures are built on a history of sort of exclusion. And so the question is, like, how do you decolonize space? How do you create more inclusive spaces? And then in the same way, that in my policy and planning work, it's really important for me to reckon with history and to have a deep sense of how places came to be shaped the way they are. I bring that into my writing, where sort of in my writing, I'm also really concerned with like a sense of history and context as well. So I do think there's this kind of intersection and interplay.
Janet asks, have you ever been to Armenia?
I have not, although I have plans to at some point. And I've actually connected to a lot of sort of Armenian associations and groups over the past few years, and I'm very much looking forward to being able to travel there and explore Armenian culture there as well.
Amy says she loved your book. What are you working now, and do you still work as a city planner? You kind of answered that a bit.
Thanks, Amy. I appreciate it. I'm currently working on a novel. It's sort of very early stages. I wanted to sort of write something sort of different. It is still sort of connected to my experience in life, and I'm exploring some of the same curiosities that sort of animate Aftershocks, which I think are sort of the central driving curiosities of my life, but from sort of a different narrative and story. And so that's really exciting. It's new, but it's nice to have this new project. I do work I just started a new job. I left my job of 9 years recently, where I was more clearly working on sort of urban policy and planning. In this new job, I'm working for a Black-owned consulting firm that works with nonprofits and foundations and social justice organizations to think about how to advance their work in a way that's anti-racist.
This is just my question, but I forgot to ask, how long did it take you to write this book?
So, I started, as I said, writing the book kind of as a private project, but I had done a lot of the initial research through that project And so that kind of started 10 years ago, but it wasn't until many years after that, maybe 5 or 6 years after that, that I went back to that material with more intention of sort of writing a book, and then really intentionally writing it probably for about 3 years.
So since you're, this is another one of my questions, since you're, you're working obviously full time and now you're book touring and you're working on another book, like what's your writing routine? How do you find kind of time to work on new projects?
Yeah, I have to schedule it. And usually I wish that I were one of those people who wakes up at the crack of dawn and sits at my desk. And I'm just not a morning person. That like just cannot work for me. I've tried. So what I usually do is sort of right after, I've signed off for my day job, I have 2 hours sort of scheduled on my calendar that is kind of sacred time. And sometimes, hopefully, I can sit down and immediately start writing. Sometimes I'm just thinking about writing, but that is time that's sort of dedicated to my sort of creative side and writing life. Sometimes I'm reading or doing research, but I really do try to hold that time sacred.
Okay, Sheila wants to know what the current status is of your relationship with your mother and stepmother.
Yeah, so I mean, through the process of writing this book, I really did come to a deeper understanding of who they are as people, separate from me. And I did end up reaching out to my mother kind of through the process of the private project that I was doing. And we did reconcile, and we have a relationship now that both of us are really proud of, I think. She actually has read the book. She read it in one day and has been sort of driving around New England, going to bookstores and taking photographs of it in bookstore windows. And she's been really supportive and has even come to readings, where I'm reading excerpts that might be difficult for her to hear. She's been really supportive of me telling this story. And, as I said, it has opened up opportunities for us to have conversations about our lives and about what we want our relationship to look like in the future. My stepmother and I also are still in relationship. She's my brother's mom, and my brother was married, got married. I think it's like now 3 years ago. And so I went to Ghana for the wedding and we spent time together, and we're working on it. It's a work in progress.
Another question, when you came to America, were you treated differently than African Americans by teachers, etc.? Was a distinction ever made between you and American-born Blacks by white people?
Well, most people, unless they saw my last name and kind of asked questions, didn't know that I wasn't African American or Black. I mean, I am in some ways Black American and African American, but American born. So I think that was part of why my experiences was different from a lot of African immigrants, in that I was assumed to be from here by a lot of white people until they asked questions. There was sometimes this sort of when I did say, oh, I grew up in Africa and Europe, sometimes there was this kind of annoying like recognition of like, oh, I understand now, so which spoke to me to like a prejudice, and sort of a desire to to sort of distinguish me from Black Americans. And I am also aware of the ways in which some African immigrants and immigrants from other places who are Black kind of distance themselves from Black Americans too in harmful ways, because they've come to understand the racial arrangement in this country. And I've heard people say things like, oh, I'm not that kind of Black, which I think is so damaging and so like divisive in terms of the Black community and the ways that we can be in solidarity and recognize each other's experiences that are different and that are not the same. And I certainly wouldn't try to claim that experience that is in mine, but at the same time, I feel really strongly, and particularly given the amazing way that I was sort of welcomed to America by the African American community, to stand in solidarity always with Black Americans and to be led by their vision for this country in the work that I'm doing in social justice as well.
Another question. Angelica wants to know, what are you reading now and why did you choose this book?
The book that I'm reading. Why did I choose the book that I'm reading now?
Yeah.
So right now I'm reading The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. And the reason that I decided to choose it was because I was really I heard him kind of talking about the book in different events. And I was really intrigued by this notion again, because I'm so passionate about sort of reclaiming and revising history. And so his novel sort of centers the experience of two enslaved men who are in love. And, you know, that is a story that hasn't been told, but obviously must have happened and been real. And so I really loved this idea of sort of centering that experience and sort of writing people into history that, you know, is often denied.
What was the purpose of your stepmother? You addressed this a little bit, but what was the purpose of your stepmother telling you about your father dying of AIDS?
Um, you know, that's difficult to know. We haven't really spoken about it. It's like one of those conversations that we haven't come to yet. I think it's very difficult for both of us to talk about that. Um, you know, she said it out of anger. We were having an argument. And so, in some ways, I think that she might have said it to hurt me. But I don't know what else was going on with her. You know, maybe she was hurt too by something that was happening in her life, or maybe this has been a difficult thing for her to carry. You know, as I said, I don't know if it's true or not to this day. And I kind of decided that it doesn't matter to me because it doesn't change my relationship with my father. And I reject the notion that there are more noble illnesses to die from than others. And so I decided not to investigate that further. But so I don't really know the answer to that question.
What advice do you have for adults reconnecting with a parent who abandoned them in childhood? How can someone push through the anger and the emotions that come with it?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, you know, and I think it's really important. Or one thing that I have felt was really important in my relationship with my mother was to acknowledge the hurt that I was carrying and not to kind of sweep it under the rug and not to pretend that it's not there and to not to pretend that I don't still feel it sometimes. And to be able to be honest with her about that, but to try to do it from a place that's not a place of anger, you know. And you know, one of the things that I kind of learned in writing this book was that um, that I wanted to write myself to a place of love and connection and understanding, and that is going to be an ongoing process. It's a daily practice. It's a choice that we make every day, and some days are better than others. But kind of allowing myself to both feel the hurt and the grief, but being open to the possibility of deeper connection and love as well.
Deb has a question comment. I had a lot of similar experiences as a child hopping from country to country. Out of curiosity, have you ever encountered others who share the same Ghanaian Armenian heritage?
I've never met a Ghanaian Armenian, but I've met a lot of other Armenian Black people, and from different backgrounds. Um, and I've met an Armenian, a Ghanaian Lebanese person as well, who had some connection to Armenia, had spent some time in Armenia. But that exact combination I haven't yet, but I'm sure that there are others out there.
Abena says, I'm interested to know how your book has been received in Ghanaian communities.
So far, really beautifully. I mean, I think I did an event recently with a Ghanaian American writer, and one of the things that he said to me was that he was really excited about seeing Ghanaian history in a book like this. You know, it's not history that is commonly found in, you know, books when you go to school. And I was really intentional about doing a lot of deep research and looking into research that was written not from the Western or white perspective, but from the Ghanaian perspective, and looking at sort of Ashanti history, the history of my family's tribe before colonization, you know, because often the history that we're given kind of starts with colonization, but what existed before in terms of the culture. And so I've been really moved by sort of the ways in which the book has been embraced and discussed.
Another question, if you have children, will you strive to give them a rooted in place upbringing or a more cosmopolitan experience such as you experienced?
Well, I have lived in New York for all of my adult life. I moved here when I was 18 and I've stayed, and it feels like a kind of home to me. I could see myself moving around more, and I'm definitely very still deeply connected to my Ghanaian family in the UK and in Ghana. And I pre-pandemic would spend significant amounts of time there, and so that would certainly be part of the experience. But I do feel more rooted as an adult, and the work that I do is more centered in the U.S. But I don't know. I guess I'm still open.
There's a lot of questions. Very long. Where do you feel at home? And this kind of relates to a question I wanted to ask you too. Just why do you feel? You mentioned New York as your home. What was it about New York that made it the place that you wanted to settle down?
I think probably because I moved here on my own. It was the first place where I moved on my own, and I grew up in such a nomadic way, and so having to be here for at least for the 4 years of college kind of gave me this feeling of kind of rootedness. And then I met some amazing people who are still my community today here in New York, and I really loved having that connection to people that I had known for a long time, which I didn't have a lot of growing up. There were some like friends of my father's who would show up in my life frequently, but often didn't live in the same place as us. But I actually don't think of New York as like the one home, like my one home. I think over the years I've really come to define, and one of the biggest gifts of this book, in fact, writing this book for me, was that it allowed me to come to define home and family really expansively, and to claim all the places and people that I've lived among and loved and tried to belong to, even in complicated ways, as home, through my love for them. But that, it has taken me a long time to get there.
I'll just do one more question, two more questions. So Barbara says, I'm a psychoanalyst and found your discussion of the conflation trauma of your mother returning and your earthquake metaphor so interesting and consistent with what we know about people in my profession. Did you have any professional help through any of this? You speak so eloquently about your experiencing, and it's very compelling. Thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you so much. And that's so interesting to hear. I tried to sort of power through it by myself for a very long time, and certainly sort of the writing that I was doing was a way to sort of move myself towards some sense of sort of healing and belonging. But yes, I did go to therapy, and that was a really important decision that I made. For so long I sort of avoided it, for a lot of reasons. There was like stigma attached to mental health issues in many of the communities that I grew up in. But that was sort of like a turning point for me, was sort of seeking help, finding a therapist who really helped me to kind of understand trauma and the way that grief and trauma have sort of shaped my experience, and given me some tools to sort of be able to live with it and move through it and look at it in different ways.
Robert asks, in your book, your life was in flux a lot. Did writing the book help you give closure to your past?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I have closure. I think that a lot of the questions that I raise in the book, even now I'm writing some essays and I'm coming at them from different angles. But what it did was allow me to imagine different possibilities and different ways of understanding my experience. Um, and ways of understanding my experience that were like celebrations, not all sort of grounded in sort of the grief and the trauma, but also ways of looking at my upbringing in ways that were really celebratory. And that has been really meaningful to me and has opened up new questions that are connected to the questions that sort of animate the book, that I think I'll be exploring for the rest of my life in some ways.
Great. I think I'm going to close out here because we're over time. But thank you so much for allowing me to be in conversation with you, Nadia. And thanks to the Philadelphia Free Public Library.
Thank you so much. And thanks to the library. And thank you everyone for coming. This has been lovely.